Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Chris with Inside the U. I just want to provide a little bit of my observations and thoughts on this Georgia Tech 24-21 win over number 10 Florida State because it was the first college football game of the season, an ACC game, certainly a big one for both teams and for Miami, who will face both of these teams later on in the season. And I just want to kind of provide some of my thoughts, even though a lot can happen between now and when Miami faces these teams, as they won't take on Florida State until October, and then Georgia Tech in Atlanta in November. So a lot of games before that. But, just with this game, there are three things with each team that I want to talk about that stood out to me. First off, with Florida State. The very first thing I want to talk about is kind of that downfield passing attack that we just didn't see from Florida State with DJ Uiagalelei there making his first start for the Seminoles. There were moments where I thought he looked good. I thought he was efficient in terms of his completion percent, completing 70% of his passes, which is certainly a good thing. However, many of them were not very far. There was a stat at one point during the game, just not a lot of throws at all that even traveled more than 5 yards in the air. So they wanted to definitely go with a short passing game. And I thought early on in the game, early on in most games, you want to kind of establish yourself being able to do different things, because later on in the game, you don't want to be so predictable or do something that you haven't been doing throughout the game. And I thought early on that would have been a better time to really get them going, to try to really attempt more passes downfield. And they just even when they did throw it or had opportunities, he was either off on some throws or guys weren't getting open, or that maybe it was some check down type stuff that was going on. But I just thought early on, I think they could have done a better job of trying to get the ball downfield, because, again, it could have helped things out later on in the game, but also kind of loosened things up maybe in their run game, for example. But because they were not able to really stretch the field with their passing attack, and that'll be something I think to watch for throughout the season, because they do have some guys that have some good speed on the outside. But if their mentality is to kind of keep it short, play more of this conservative game, some short passing attack, be efficient there, but not really go for the big, deep ball, I think that they kind of limit them. So it'll be something to really watch for Florida State. And before I get into the other two things, I just want to look at Florida State's schedule here, because a lot is going to happen with their schedule kind of moving forward. And Miami doesn't face Florida State here until October 26th. And when you look at Florida State's schedule, that will be their 7th ACC game. They'll only have one more after that against North Carolina. So they're going to be able to, get that ACC experience. The only one non-conference game there against Memphis. In contrast, for Miami, that will be their 4th ACC game in their schedule. So Florida State has an ability to bounce back. Certainly Boston College is a struggling team, so you get them at home, then facing Memphis and Cal before, the SMU, which another team that you can watch later on tonight. They have their first game of the season if you're interested in watching more ACC action. A lot of ACC teams, which I put on the ticker below, are in action before Miami faces Florida. So you can see a lot of those ACC teams, maybe get some thoughts on the conference and what you think of these teams. SMU, another reason maybe to watch, new to the ACC, and they have 8 former Hurricanes on the roster. So it's definitely, you'll see some familiar faces when you check them out against Nevada. And going back to Florida State, the other two things I definitely want to touch on that stood out to me in watching this game. The second thing was the rushing attack. This is a team that, look, if they didn't want to throw the ball downfield, because of Georgia Tech's really struggles against defending the run a year ago, I felt like Florida State felt like they could run the ball. And they did have 31 attempts, so clearly they wanted to try to run the ball. It wasn't until later in the game that they really tried to throw it a little bit more. But they only managed 98 rushing yards, and I'm sure that's going to be a point of emphasis for the Seminoles, the coaches, the players. They want to run the ball much better than that, certainly against a team that struggled against the run a year ago. But the 98 yards, there was a 28-yarder in there by Toa Feely, but other than that, really bottled down and not a lot of opportunities, didn't create a lot of holes. They were tackled behind the line of scrimmage at times, just weren't able to get the good running game going. I think that definitely could have helped the passing attack. But again, Georgia Tech certainly did a great job defensively, but I think that was a big thing from their running, their rushing attack. And another thing that stood out to me, rushing attack, just kind of following up with that is they had 4 guys they wanted to hand the ball off, and all 4 of these guys got the ball in the first half. So that'll be something to kind of watch for if they're going to shorten the rotation, or if they're going to kind of keep kind of moving forward with multiple guys getting opportunities. So that's just something that stood out to me with the running game. And then the third thing I want to touch on with Florida State before I get into Georgia Tech, because there's a lot I want to talk about with Georgia Tech as well, is defensively. And look, this was a game that went back and forth. These teams traded scoring drives throughout the game. Started off with Florida State's touchdown drive there to begin the game, and ending with the game-winning field goal, obviously, by Georgia Tech. But, defensively, I just thought Florida State didn't make enough plays. The only 3 tackles for loss. They had the 1 pass breakup, but just didn't do enough to really impact the game. Look, they only give up the 24 points. Typically, that's not terrible, but I just thought there weren't enough impact plays, and they weren't able to get off the field. Georgia Tech was able to have these long drives. Florida State did too. Look, 4 of the last 5 drives in the game by the teams combined were 10 plays or more. So certainly there were some long, sustaining, some tough drives by both offenses. But I just thought Florida State's defensive effort, I thought they could have been better. They needed to be better defensively to kind of make more of an impact, to really gain control of the game. And really where I thought Georgia Tech gained control of the game was when they broke that 14-all tie with that long drive there in the third quarter. Haynes King gets going there, and then they score the touchdown there early in the fourth quarter. That was a big one. Florida State, when I touched on getting off the field and stopping drives, that's where they needed to do that there, because then all of a sudden you're down 21-14 in the fourth, chasing points, chasing the game there, not in control. I thought that was a big point. Again, defensively, I thought they needed to be better there. Now, with Georgia Tech, and they've got a really interesting team to pay attention to. Look, Florida State was picked to win the conference this year. Georgia Tech was picked to finish 9th. They're coming off a 7-win season, 5-3 in the conference. But with that, and I found it to be interesting that they were picked where they were picked, because they do have a lot of guys, key guys on offense and defense, but offense in particular coming back from a year ago, even Haynes King. Look, I think Haynes is one of the most underrated guys in the ACC, and I think I know why. It's that interception total from a year ago was really high, but when you look at his yards, his touchdowns, the way he played, I just thought he was a guy that was certainly a guy that could be one of the best in the ACC. I think he's one of those guys that could put together a great season, building off of last year. And in this game, look, he only attempted 16 passes, but in those key moments, he made really big throws, whether it was some third down throws or just kind of when they decided to throw the ball a little bit more. For a long time, he only had the 5 attempts in the game, as they were really wanting to run the ball. And that stood out to me. That's my biggest takeaway. Number one was Haynes King, his performance, avoided the interception. They had some throws that maybe were a little bit tight, but with the passing attack and going to Singleton and Rutherford, 2 smaller receivers, but I think that'll be something to watch for when Miami faces them. Both of those receivers were used quite a bit, either on shallow crosses, running across the middle, kind of get in some space, some catch and run type opportunities. And to me, from a Miami perspective, again, it's not till late November or in November there, late in the season. But I think of a guy like 2 guys, Wesley Bissaint from a linebacker perspective, just being able to kind of handle the middle of the field. If he's got to run out and kind of help on the wide receivers there, I think he's going to be big in that game. Also defending Haynes King, but also Darryl Porter, one of the smaller corners on the team. I think he'll be matched up against one of those 2 guys. And those 2 guys did have experience from a year ago. And I just think with what they had, from a passing perspective with Haynes King and some of the things I saw in this game, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they go moving forward. I think they're well coached. I think they're better than the 9th best team in the ACC. And I think that they're going to be one of those top 5 teams. I think they could be top 6, top 5, maybe even contend if they can kind of get some more wins. They do have a tough schedule ahead. All of their games against FBS opponents last year played in a bowl game. So tough schedule ahead for Georgia Tech, but a lot of toughness they showed. And that's really my second thing I want to talk about with the Yellow Jackets, because Coach definitely wanted to, instill that in them since he got there. And I think today in his post-game comments after the game talked about the toughness, and that stood out to me with how they were able to run the ball, not just with Jamal Haynes, but, with the 75 yards, 2 touchdowns on 11 carries, but they finished with 190 rushing yards in a game like this, a tough opponent. And they really instilled their physical physicality up front with their offensive line. They've got a lot of returners on the offensive line, but again, just pounding the run. Even Alexander gets in there and he makes some nice runs, some cutback moves. And I just thought they did a great job running the ball. And that's my second takeaway. And I think that's what can kind of make this team a little bit more dynamic, maybe even than we saw a year ago, if they can kind of be more efficient. But with King throwing the ball, using their speed on the outside with their receivers, and then kind of sprinkling in this running game, which is very interesting when you watch them, and they did touch on it, just the different types of runs that they have here. And it's interesting here in Georgia Tech how well they run the ball now, from like last year, for example, or in this game, because it is different from the Georgia Tech rushing attack that we saw so prominent in college football years ago, with their attack and how they wanted to run the ball before under Paul Johnson. So it's different, but they're still a physical team, guys that can make plays. And those are my two big things that I noticed from the Georgia Tech offense. And look, defensively, my third takeaway from Georgia Tech is I think they made a statement defensively. Look, they changed their coaching staff. A lot of defensive coaches kind of came in. They wanted to be better defensively. And I think you saw that today. Look, Florida State's got things that they're going to work on. They're not a well-oiled machine by any means right now offensively. But I think Georgia Tech, again, made a statement not just to their team and their fan base from where they were a year ago defensively, but I think to the ACC because of how well they played defensively in this game. Guys were flying around the ball. They did have more tackles for loss than Florida State, so they were doing some things defensively. I thought they did a good job. Again, really did a great job stopping the run. And on the back end, if Florida State did want to kind of make some throws downfield, Georgia Tech certainly cut some of that off because they didn't allow the deep throws. And I think Georgia Tech's defense really made a statement. And I think Miami in general, kind of summing this up as we look forward to Miami's next game, their first game against Florida. But just with Miami, look, they lost to both of these teams a year ago. And I think, to be overconfident, I don't think that's the way to go with either of these teams. Florida State obviously didn't look as good as they did last season, but it's still going to be a tough game. Everyone knows that. And I think the biggest takeaway with Georgia Tech winning, I think that should put a lot of teams, especially Miami, on notice of a team that can certainly be a threat. And I think it just adds another one of these teams in the ACC of being a threat on the schedule when you play them. And certainly we will see how things go with Georgia Tech moving forward, with where they land. Are they, I don't think they are, but are they the ninth best team in the ACC? Or are they going to have a season where they, more top 4, top 5? Or are they actually going to contend for one of those top spots with the guys they have coming back, Haynes King, and kind of the growth of the program that they have? So we'll see. One person did pick Georgia Tech to win the ACC, so we'll see if they're correct. But certainly that person thought highly of the Yellow Jackets. I think they were better than ninth coming into the season, but there's a lot of good teams, a lot of tough teams with veteran quarterbacks, some positive things. I think it's just going to be a really tough schedule to navigate. And I think both of these teams, after today's game, certainly have a lot of things to work on, but I don't think that the results from this game will necessarily impact the whole season, just like with Miami and Florida. Look, if Miami wins at Florida, it's a great win. But just like we saw last year with Texas A&M, that was a great win, and the season didn't build off of that. And same way if Miami loses to Florida, certainly a disappointment. You don't want to lose that game against a rival there after being the ranked team and whatnot. But it doesn't end your season. And that's the big takeaway from week 1, the game, week 0, whatever this might be, whatever, that first game of the season for teams. You've got to get a lot better. It can't be the best early on. And certainly if you lose, it's not over. If you win, it's not a completed season. A lot to go, especially with this 12-team college football playoff. Both these teams, as we watch, I'm sure they have aspirations of being one of those 12 teams, like many teams in the country. So those are my thoughts. And as far as Miami and Florida and some content moving forward, I've got things in the works, things planned in terms of talking to other people about this game. I'm really looking forward to those conversations. And as far as Miami, Florida interview schedule for the upcoming week, has not sent out anything. We do know that there's going to be a press conference Monday with the coach and I assume the coordinators. So definitely stay tuned for that. And then we'll see in terms of access moving forward. So I'm excited to talk about this next game with Miami and Florida. It's been a long off season, a lot of things going on to it. And I think it's a huge game. It's certainly going to be a lot of fun. I'll be up there in Gainesville and looking forward to that and looking forward to the whole season in general. So definitely drop in the comments below. Let me know what you thought of this game. What are the things that stood out to you? Was there some things that stood out to you that I didn't mention? Or, was it just the fact that maybe you just look at it from a Florida State perspective that they're not going to be as good? And that's is a great thing for Miami, because I know Miami fans certainly always like to see Florida State lose. So maybe that's your just overall takeaway. So thanks for watching. Definitely stay tuned for more content on the channel, and take care.